It's easy to assume that the future is something that simply arrives on its own, like the weather changing outside your window. But the deeper truth is more unsettling and, at the same time, more empowering. The future is quietly being packed, piece by piece, by the decisions you make today. Not in dramatic, life-altering moments alone, but in the small, almost invisible choices that repeat themselves every single day. Think about how people often imagine their future. They picture big milestones, success, stability, freedom, fulfillment. But very few stop to consider what actually gets them there. The reality is that your future is not built in grand gestures. It is assembled in habits, in priorities, in what you tolerate, and in what you consistently avoid. Every action you take is like placing an item into a suitcase you will eventually have to carry. What makes this idea powerful is that most people are already packing. They are just not aware of it. When you delay something important, you are packing procrastination. When you choose comfort over growth, you are packing limitation. When you invest time in learning, building, or improving, you are packing capability. The process never stops. Whether you are intentional or not, the suitcase keeps filling. There's also a subtle danger here. Because the consequences are delayed, it's easy to believe that your choices don't matter much. Skipping effort today doesn't feel like a big deal. Avoiding discomfort feels harmless. But over time, these patterns accumulate. And one day, you open that suitcase and realize it contains exactly what you've been preparing, whether you like it or not. This is where awareness becomes a turning point. Once you recognize that your future is being packed in real time, you begin to see your daily life differently. Time is no longer something to pass, it becomes something to invest. Energy is no longer something to spend carelessly, it becomes something to direct. Even your environment starts to matter more, because the people and influences around you quietly shape what goes into your future. Another important layer to this idea is responsibility. Not in a heavy, guilt-driven sense, but in a clear, grounded understanding that your life is largely shaped by what you repeatedly do. It doesn't mean you control everything. External circumstances, luck, and timing all play their roles. But within that uncertainty, your patterns still carry immense weight. There's also a psychological shift that happens when you start thinking this way. Instead of chasing outcomes, you begin to focus on inputs. Instead of obsessing over where you want to be, you pay attention to what you are doing right now. This reduces anxiety in a surprising way. Because when you are focused on the present action, the thing you can control, the future becomes less overwhelming and more manageable. At the same time, this way of thinking demands honesty. It asks you to look at your current life and see it as a reflection of past packing. Not as a judgment, but as information. If something isn't working, it's a sign that certain patterns need to change. If something is working, it's worth understanding why, so you can continue building on it. There's also an element of patience woven into all of this. Since the results are delayed, you have to trust the process without immediate proof. This is where most people struggle. They want quick feedback, instant rewards, visible progress. But future packing doesn't work that way. It's slow, steady, and often invisible, until it suddenly isn't. And then there's the question of intention. If you're already packing your future, the real question becomes, what exactly are you choosing to pack? Skills or distractions? Discipline or avoidance? Clarity or confusion? Growth or stagnation? These are not abstract ideas. They show up in how you spend your mornings, how you respond to challenges, how you handle boredom, and what you prioritize when no one is watching. What makes this concept even more compelling is that it doesn't require dramatic change to begin. You don't need a complete life overhaul. You just need to start noticing. Noticing your patterns, your defaults, your habits. From there, small adjustments begin to compound. A better decision here, a more intentional action there. Over time, these shifts start to redefine what you are carrying forward. But there's a deeper layer that often goes unspoken. It's not just about productivity or success. It's about identity. Because what you repeatedly do doesn't just shape your results, it shapes who you become. And once your identity begins to shift, your actions follow more naturally. The process becomes less about forcing change and more about aligning with a different version of yourself. Still, exactly as you are right now, where would that path actually lead? That's where things start to get interesting, because once you begin to confront that question honestly, you can no longer move through your days on autopilot. And the moment that awareness takes hold, the way you approach even the smallest decisions begins to change in ways you might not expect. there's a quiet moment that comes after awareness, and it's often uncomfortable. It's the moment when you realize that many of your current results didn't happen randomly. They were built, slowly and consistently, by patterns you once ignored. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You can't unsee it anymore. What makes this phase difficult is not the realization itself, but what it demands from you. Because now, it's no longer about guessing why things are the way they are. It becomes about deciding whether you're willing to change what you're putting into your future from this point forward. Most people underestimate how deeply their habits are tied to comfort. Not just physical comfort, but psychological comfort, familiarity, predictability, the ease of doing what you've always done. Even when those patterns lead to outcomes you don't want, they still feel safe because they're known. And breaking away from that requires a different kind of effort. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, consistent, and often invisible to others. This is where the idea of intentional friction comes into play. If your current habits are leading you somewhere you don't want to go, then continuing to follow them effortlessly is the real risk. So instead of making everything easier, you begin to make certain choices slightly harder. You create small barriers between yourself and the patterns that no longer serve you. Not in a restrictive or punishing way, but in a thoughtful, deliberate way. At the same time, you make better choices easier. You reduce the resistance around the things you know will benefit you. You simplify them. You make them accessible. Over time, this subtle shift starts to change your default behavior. And once your defaults begin to change, your future starts to take a different shape without requiring constant willpower. There's also something important to understand about motivation. It's unreliable. It comes and goes, often influenced by mood, environment, and external circumstances. If you rely on it to guide your actions, your future becomes inconsistent. But when you build systems, small, repeatable actions that don't depend on how you feel, you create stability. And stability is what allows progress to compound. But even with systems in place, there will be moments where you slip back into old patterns. That's inevitable. The difference now is that you notice it faster. Instead of drifting for weeks or months, you catch it early. And that awareness shortens the gap between mistake and correction. Over time, that alone creates a massive difference in where you end up. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is the influence of your environment. The people you spend time with, the content you consume, the conversations you engage in, all of these quietly contribute to what you're packing. If you're constantly surrounded by distraction, negativity, or low standards, it becomes significantly harder to build a future that requires focus, optimism, and discipline. This doesn't mean you need to isolate yourself or drastically cut people off, but it does mean you need to be more selective, more aware. You start to notice which environments pull you forward and which ones hold you back. And slowly, you begin to spend more time in spaces that align with the future you're trying to create. There's also a deeper emotional component to all of this. Because as you begin to change your patterns, you're not just adjusting your actions, you're letting go of parts of your current identity. And that can feel unsettling. Even if those parts weren't serving you, they were still familiar. There's a certain comfort in being who you've always been, even if it limits you. But growth requires a kind of quiet detachment. Not from who you are at your core, but from the habits and narratives that no longer fit. You begin to see yourself less as a fixed identity and more as something that's continuously evolving. And once you adopt that perspective, change becomes less threatening and more natural. What's interesting is that as this process continues, your relationship with time starts to shift again. You become less focused on immediate results and more interested in long-term direction. You start asking different questions. Not, what do I feel like doing today, but, what would the person I'm becoming choose right now? That single shift in thinking can quietly reshape your decision without visible reward. Because the truth is, for a while, nothing seems to change. You are putting in effort, adjusting your habits, being more intentional, and the results still look the same. This is the phase where most people stop. Not because they don't care, but because they interpret the lack of immediate progress as failure. But what's actually happening is something far more subtle. The suitcase is being repacked. Old items are being removed, new ones are being added, and the overall direction is shifting, even if you can't see it yet. And then, gradually, things begin to surface. Small changes at first. A slightly better outcome here, a bit more clarity there. And over time, those small shifts start to compound into something noticeable, something real. But by the time those results appear, something else has already changed, something more important than the outcomes themselves. The way you think, the way you choose, the way you respond to challenges, it's no longer the same. And that raises an even more important question. If your actions are now aligned with a different version of yourself, then what? At some point, the focus quietly shifts from changing what you do to understanding why you do it. Because once your actions start becoming more intentional, you begin to notice the deeper patterns underneath them. The habits were never just about discipline or laziness. They were reflections of beliefs, often unspoken, sometimes unnoticed, but always influential. If someone consistently avoids challenges, it's rarely because they lack ability. More often, it's because somewhere along the way, they started believing that failure defines them. If someone delays important work, it's not always poor time management. It can be tied to fear of not doing it well enough, fear of being judged, or even fear of succeeding and having to maintain that standard. This is where future packing becomes more than just a practical idea. It becomes psychological. Because what you're really placing into your future isn't just actions, it's beliefs, identities, and internal narratives that guide those actions. And the tricky part is that these beliefs often operate in the background. You don't consciously think about them when making decisions. They show up automatically, shaping your responses without asking for permission. That's why two people in the same situation can make completely different choices, even if they have similar goals. So the question becomes, how do you change something that isn't always visible? It starts with observation, but not in a judgmental way. You begin to notice your reactions. When you avoid something, you ask yourself why. When you hesitate, you pay attention to what thought comes up first. Over time, patterns start to reveal themselves. And once you can see them clearly, you're no longer operating blindly. But awareness alone isn't enough. You also need to challenge what you find. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but with curiosity. You start questioning whether those beliefs are actually true, or just familiar. Whether they're helping you move forward, or quietly keeping you in place. What's interesting is that many of these beliefs were formed long ago, often in completely different circumstances. They made sense at the time. They served a purpose. But as your life changes, they don't always update themselves. And if you don't actively examine them, they continue influencing your decisions long after they've stopped being useful. There's also a subtle shift that happens when you begin to question your own thinking. You create space between yourself and your thoughts. Instead of automatically believing everything that comes to mind, you start to see thoughts as possibilities, not instructions. And that space gives you something powerful: choice. Now, instead of reacting based on old patterns, you can respond based on intention. You can choose the action that aligns with where you want to go, rather than where you've been. This is where identity starts to evolve more clearly. Because as you repeatedly choose differently, you begin to see yourself differently. Not in a forced or artificial way, but through evidence. You kept your word to yourself. You followed through. You handled something you used to avoid. These small proofs start to build a new internal narrative. And once that narrative strengthens, your actions require less effort. Discipline becomes less about pushing yourself and more about staying consistent with who you believe you are. The friction decreases, not because things are easier, but because you're no longer fighting yourself in the same way. But even here, there's an important balance to maintain. It's easy to swing too far into control, trying to optimize every moment, analyze every decision, and eliminate every flaw. But that creates its own kind of pressure. And over time, that pressure becomes unsustainable. Future packing isn't about perfection. It's about direction. It's about making slightly better choices, more often, over time. It's about understanding that occasional setbacks don't erase progress, they're part of the process. In fact, they often reveal the exact areas that need more attention. There's also a deeper kind of patience that develops at this stage. Not just patience with results, but patience with yourself. You begin to accept that change is layered. Some patterns shift quickly, others take longer. And that's not a sign of failure, it's simply how growth works. As this perspective settles in, something else begins to change. Your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of needing everything to be clear and predictable, you become more comfortable moving forward without having all the answers. Because you trust the process you've built. You trust your ability to adjust, to learn, to respond. And that trust becomes one of the most valuable things you can carry. Final layer to consider. Because even if you've changed your habits, your environment, and your beliefs, there's one thing that ultimately determines how your future unfolds. It's not just what you do occasionally, or even what you do intentionally. It's what you do consistently, especially when no one is watching, when nothing feels urgent, and when there's no immediate reward. An understanding that changes the way you see even the most ordinary moments. Most of life is made up of moments that don't feel important while they're happening. Quiet mornings, routine decisions, small actions repeated without much thought. These are the spaces where no one is watching, where there's no pressure to perform, and where it's easy to believe that what you do doesn't really matter. But this is exactly where your future is shaped most powerfully. Because consistency doesn't reveal itself in dramatic situations. It reveals itself in the ordinary. It's in whether you follow through on something small after a long day. It's in whether you choose focus over distraction when no one would notice either way. It's in how you handle boredom, frustration, or uncertainty when there's no immediate consequence attached. What makes this challenging is that these moments don't offer instant feedback. There's no clear signal telling you that you're on the right path. No immediate reward reinforcing your effort. And because of that, it's easy to drift. To tell yourself that skipping one time doesn't matter, that you'll get back on track later, that it's not a big deal. Individually, those decisions are small, but collectively, they define your direction. There's a certain honesty in these quiet choices. When there's no audience, no deadline, no external pressure, your actions reflect your true priorities. Not what you say matters, but what actually does. And over time, those priorities become your reality. This is why building a strong internal standard becomes so important. Not a rigid set of rules, but a clear sense of how you operate, regardless of circumstances. It's the difference between acting based on mood and acting based on principle. When your behavior is guided by something stable, it becomes less dependent on how you feel in the moment. But developing that kind of standard takes time. It's built through repetition, through showing up for yourself consistently, even in small ways. And each time you do, you reinforce a simple but powerful idea, that your actions are not negotiable based on convenience. There's also a deeper sense of self-respect that comes from this. Not the kind that comes from external validation, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself. That when you decide something matters, you follow through. And that trust changes how you approach everything else in your life. At the same time, it's important to recognize that consistency doesn't mean rigidity. Life is unpredictable. There will be disruptions, unexpected challenges, moments where things don't go as planned. And in those moments, the goal isn't to maintain perfection, it's to maintain direction. You adapt without abandoning your standards. You adjust without losing momentum. And most importantly, you don't let temporary setbacks redefine your overall path. Another shift that happens here is in how you measure progress. Instead of looking for big, visible outcomes, you start paying attention to patterns. Are you showing up more often than before? Are your decisions slightly better than they used to be? Are you recovering faster when you slip? These are the signals that matter, even if they're not immediately visible to anyone else. Over time, these patterns begin to compound in a way that's almost invisible at first. The effort feels the same, the days feel similar, but something beneath the surface is building. Skills are sharpening. Thinking is becoming clearer. Reactions are becoming more intentional. And slowly, the gap between who you were and who you're becoming starts to widen. What's interesting is that from the outside, this process often looks unremarkable. There's no sudden transformation, no dramatic shift, but internally, everything is changing. And eventually, those internal changes begin to reflect outwardly in ways that are undeniable. Opportunities start to appear that you're actually prepared for. Challenges that once felt overwhelming become manageable. Decisions that used to create stress become clearer. And it's not because the world has changed, it's because you have. This is where the idea of future packing comes full circle. Because by now, you're no longer just reacting to life as it happens. You're actively shaping what comes next. Not by trying to control every outcome, but by controlling what you can, but purposeful. That what you're building may not be fully visible yet, but it's real. But even with all of this in place, there's still one final realization that brings everything together in a deeper way. It's the understanding that the future you've been packing isn't some distant version of your life waiting far ahead. It's something you begin experiencing much sooner than you think, in the way you think, the way you act, and the way you see yourself long before the results fully arrive. There comes a point where the idea of the future stops feeling distant altogether. It no longer sits somewhere far ahead, waiting to be reached. Instead, it starts to feel closer, almost woven into your present experience. Not because everything has fallen into place, but because the way you think and act has already begun to reflect the direction you once hoped for. This is a subtle shift, but a powerful one. You begin to notice that the person you were trying to become is no longer just an idea in your mind. It shows up in how you handle your time, how you respond to pressure, how you make decisions when things are uncertain. The external results may still be unfolding, but internally, something has already changed. And that changes how you relate to progress. It's no longer something you chase in the form of outcomes alone. It becomes something you recognize in your daily behavior. In the way you choose focus over distraction without needing to force it. In the way you follow through on commitments without overthinking. In the way you recover quickly when things don't go as planned. There's also a growing sense of clarity that comes with this. Not necessarily about every detail of your future, but about your direction. You may not know exactly where every step will lead, but you trust the path you're on. And that trust removes a lot of the noise that used to create hesitation. Before, decisions might have felt heavy. You might have overanalyzed, second-guessed, or delayed action because you were unsure. But now, there's a different approach. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and then you move forward. You adjust along the way if needed, but you don't stay stuck in place. This doesn't mean doubt disappears completely. It still shows up from time to time, but it no longer controls your actions. It becomes something you notice, not something you obey, and that distinction is what allows you to keep moving, even when things aren't perfectly clear. Another important change happens in how you experience effort. It starts to feel different, less like something you have to push yourself into, and more like something that aligns with who you are becoming. The resistance that once felt overwhelming begins to fade, not because the work is easier, but because you're no longer in conflict with it. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They expect that growth will always feel difficult, that discipline must always feel like force. But what actually happens over time is a kind of alignment. Your actions, your identity, and your direction begin to support each other instead of pulling in different directions. And when that alignment strengthens, consistency becomes more natural. Not automatic, but smoother. You spend less energy convincing yourself to do what matters, and more energy actually doing it. And that shift frees up mental space for deeper thinking, for creativity, for better decisions. There's also a deeper appreciation that develops for the process itself. You start to value the daily practice, the small improvements, the quiet discipline, not just as a means to an end, but as something meaningful on its own. Because you recognize that this is where your life is actually being lived, not in some future moment, but right here, in what you do every day. At the same time, your definition of success begins to evolve. It becomes less about reaching a specific point and more about maintaining a certain way of operating, a certain standard of thinking, acting, and responding. The outcomes still matter, but they're no longer the only measure. And this brings a kind of stability that's easy to overlook but deeply valuable. Because when your sense of progress isn't tied only to external results, you're less affected by fluctuations. You don't lose momentum just because something didn't work out immediately. You stay grounded in what you can control. As this way of thinking settles in, you also become more intentional about what you allow into your life. Not just in terms of habits, but in terms of influences. You become more aware of what supports your direction and what quietly pulls you away from it. And without needing to make extreme changes, you begin to adjust. Some things you naturally move closer to. Of this is that future packing was never just about preparing for what's ahead. It was about transforming how you live right now. The future was simply the entry point, the idea that made you pay attention. But what you gain along the way is something more immediate. A stronger sense of control over your actions. A clearer understanding of your patterns. A deeper trust in your ability to move forward, even without perfect conditions. And in the end, that's what makes the biggest difference. Not a perfectly planned future, but a consistently intentional present. Because when you learn how to live that way, you don't have to worry as much about what's coming next. You've already built the habits, the mindset, and the awareness that will. What often goes unnoticed, even after all these shifts, is how quietly your standards begin to influence everything around you. Not in a forceful or visible way, but in the small decisions that define the quality of your life. You start to expect more from yourself, not out of pressure, but out of alignment. And that expectation begins to ripple outward. It shows up in the way you manage your time. You become more aware of what deserves your attention and what doesn't. Distractions don't disappear, but they lose their grip. You see them for what they are, temporary pulls that don't contribute to where you're going. And instead of constantly fighting them, you simply choose differently more often. It also shows up in your relationships. You begin to value conversations that add depth, clarity, or perspective. You naturally gravitate toward people who challenge you to think better, act better, and grow. At the same time, you become more conscious of interactions that drain your energy or reinforce patterns you've worked to move away from. This doesn't mean cutting people off or creating distance in a harsh way. It's more subtle than that. It's about how much influence you allow certain dynamics to have over you. You listen, you engage, but you no longer absorb everything by default. You become selective, not judgmental. And then there's the way you handle setbacks now. Earlier, obstacles might have felt like interruptions, things that slowed you down or threw you off track. But now, they start to feel different. They become part of the process itself. Not something to avoid, but something to work through. When something doesn't go as planned, your first instinct is no longer frustration or avoidance. It's reflection. You ask yourself what can be learned, what can be adjusted, what can be done differently next time. And this simple shift turns challenges into useful feedback instead of wasted effort. There's also a growing sense of patience with outcomes. Not because you've lowered your expectations, but because you understand the timeline better. You've seen how long it takes for consistent effort to translate into visible results. And that understanding makes it easier to stay committed, even when progress feels slow. At the same time, you become more protective of your energy. not in a restrictive or defensive way, but in a deliberate one. You recognize that your attention, your focus, and your mental clarity are limited resources, and how you use them directly affects what you're able to build. So you start making small adjustments. You reduce unnecessary noise. You create space for thinking. You give yourself time to reflect instead of constantly reacting. And these changes, while simple, have a compounding effect on the quality of your decisions. Another interesting shift happens in how you view success in others. Instead of comparing or feeling behind, you become more curious. You look at what others have built and try to understand the patterns behind it, the consistency, the decisions, the trade-offs, and that perspective turns comparison into learning. This removes a lot of the emotional weight that comparison usually carries. Because instead of measuring yourself against someone else's results, you focus on what you can apply in your own process. And that keeps you grounded in your own direction. There's also a deeper sense of ownership that develops, not just over your actions, but over your trajectory as a whole. You stop waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, or the right opportunity. You start working with what you have, where you are, and you trust that progress will come from movement, not perfection. And this is where the idea of control becomes clearer. You realize that control was never about managing every outcome. It was about managing your inputs, your effort, your focus, your decisions. The rest unfolds over time. But perhaps the most meaningful change is in how you experience your own life on a day-to-day basis. There's a greater sense of presence. You're less caught up in regret about the past or anxiety about the future. Not because those thoughts never appear, but because they no longer dominate your attention. You spend more time engaged in what you're doing, more aware of how you're doing it, and more connected to why it matters. And that creates a sense of fulfillment that isn't dependent on reaching some distant milestone. Because in a way, you've already arrived somewhere important. Not at a final destination, but at a way of living that continuously moves you forward. And once you experience that, the whole concept of the future changes again. It's no longer something you're trying to reach as quickly as possible. It becomes something you're building steadily, day by day. If every day is another opportunity to pack your future, then the only real question that remains is this: when you look at how you're living right now, are you truly preparing for the life you say you want, or just hoping it arrives on its own? There's a quiet honesty in that question that doesn't leave much room for avoidance. Because once you truly ask yourself whether your current life reflects the future you want, you begin to see the gaps more clearly, not in a discouraging way, but in a revealing way. The difference between intention and action becomes visible, and that visibility is where real change begins. Most people carry a picture of the life they want. It might not always be fully defined, but it's there, a sense of freedom, stability, growth, or meaning. But what often goes unnoticed is how disconnected that vision can become from daily behavior. It's easy to want something deeply and still act in ways that don't support it. This is where alignment becomes the central idea. Not just having goals, but living in a way that supports them consistently. Because without alignment, even strong intentions lose their impact. You might feel motivated in certain moments, inspired by an idea of the future, but if your daily actions don't reflect that direction, the gap remains. And that gap has a cost. Not always immediately, but over time. It shows up as frustration, as a sense of being stuck, as the feeling that you're capable of more but not quite reaching it. And often, that feeling isn't caused by a lack of ability, it's caused by a lack of consistency between what you want and what you repeatedly do. Closing that gap doesn't require extreme change. It requires honesty and adjustment. You start by looking at your current patterns without filtering them. How you spend your time, where your energy goes, what you prioritize when you have a choice. And instead of judging those patterns, you use them as information. From there, the question becomes simple, but not always easy. What needs to shift? Sometimes the answer is obvious. A habit that clearly doesn't serve you. A distraction that takes more than it gives. A delay you've justified for too long. Other times, it's more subtle. Small inefficiencies, unclear priorities, or decisions made out of convenience rather than intention. What matters is not changing everything at once, but starting where the impact is real. You make one adjustment, then another. You refine as you go. And over time, those adjustments begin to close the gap. There's also an important realization that comes with this process. Alignment isn't something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you maintain. Because life changes, circumstances shift, priorities evolve. And as they do, your actions need to adjust as well. That's why awareness remains essential, even after progress is made. You continue checking in with yourself. Not constantly, but consistently enough to notice when you start drifting. And when you do, you correct early, before the gap widens again. Another layer to this is learning how to deal with competing priorities. Because not everything you want can happen at the same time. There are trade-offs, whether you acknowledge them or not. And being intentional means recognizing those trade-offs and choosing consciously. Instead of trying to do everything, you decide what matters most right now. You give it the attention it deserves, knowing that other things may need to wait. And that clarity reduces a lot of internal conflict. Because you're no longer trying to move in multiple directions at once. There's also a deeper sense of discipline that develops here, but it feels different from what people usually imagine. It's not rigid or forced. It's focused. It's the ability to stay aligned with what matters, even when distractions are present, even when easier options are available. And that kind of discipline doesn't feel restrictive. It feels freeing, because it removes the constant back and forth of indecision. You know what you're prioritizing, and your actions reflect that. As this becomes more natural, something else begins to happen. You start to trust your own direction more deeply, not because everything is certain, but because your actions are consistent with your intentions. And that consistency builds confidence in a way that nothing else can. You're no longer relying on external validation to feel like you're on the right path. You can see it in your own behavior, in the way you show up, in the choices you make, in how you handle both progress and setbacks. And that internal confidence changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less influenced by short-term noise, less pulled in directions that don't align with you. You move with more clarity. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty. There will still be unknowns, unexpected changes, moments where things don't unfold the way you planned. And that's where the final layer of understanding comes in. It's realizing that preparing for the future isn't just about building the right habits or making the right decisions. It's about becoming the kind of person who can handle whatever future arrives. That realization changes everything in a quiet but profound way. Because until this point, much of the focus has been on shaping outcomes, building habits, improving decisions, creating alignment so that your future unfolds in a certain direction. But now, the perspective deepens. It's no longer just about what your life becomes. It's about who you are within it, no matter how it turns out. Because the truth is, no matter how intentional you are, the future will always carry elements you can't predict. There will be opportunities you didn't plan for, challenges you didn't expect, moments that test you in ways you couldn't have prepared for directly. And when those moments come, it's not your plans that carry you through, it's your mindset, your resilience, your ability to respond. This is where all the quiet work you've been doing begins to show its real value. The consistency, the awareness, the discipline, the alignment, none of it was just about achieving specific results. It was about building a foundation within yourself. Something stable enough to handle uncertainty without collapsing into reaction. You begin to notice that you're less shaken by unexpected changes. Not because they don't matter, but because you trust your ability to adapt. When something doesn't go according to plan, you don't immediately interpret it as failure. You see it as a situation to work through. And that shift alone creates a kind of strength that's hard to measure, but easy to feel. There's also a deeper level of calm that comes with this understanding. Not the absence of problems, but the absence of constant internal resistance. You're no longer trying to control everything. You're focused on what you can influence, and you let the rest unfold as it will. This doesn't make you passive. If anything, it makes you more effective. Because your energy is no longer scattered across things you can't change. It's directed toward actions that actually move you forward. And when you operate from that place, your decisions become clearer. You don't overcomplicate every choice. You don't get stuck in endless loops of doubt. You assess, you decide, you act, and then you adjust if needed. There's also a quiet confidence in knowing that you can handle discomfort. Earlier, discomfort might have been something you avoided or delayed. Now, it becomes something you can move through. Not because you enjoy it, but because you understand its role in growth. This changes your relationship with risk as well. You're still thoughtful, still aware of consequences, but you're less controlled by fear. Because you know that even if things don't go perfectly, you'll be able to respond, to learn, to recalibrate. And that makes you more willing to step into opportunities that once felt out of reach. At the same time, you begin to value flexibility alongside discipline. You understand that being too rigid can limit your ability to adapt, while being too loose can pull you off course. So you find a balance. You stay committed to your direction, but open in your approach. This balance allows you to move forward without becoming stuck when things change. You adjust without losing momentum. You evolve without losing your core principles. There's also a deeper appreciation for the present moment that develops here, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. Because when you're no longer overly focused on controlling the future, you become more engaged with what's happening right now. You notice more. You think more clearly. You act more deliberately. And in doing so, you actually improve the quality of both your present and your future at the same time. And that's the quiet paradox at the center of all of this. The more you focus on building the right way of living today, the less you need to worry about what tomorrow will look like. Because you've already become someone who can handle it. In the end, future packing was never really about predicting or securing a perfect outcome. It was about awareness. About understanding that your life is shaped in the small, consistent moments that often go unnoticed. It was about realizing that every choice, no matter how minor it seems, carries forward. That your habits, your thoughts, your standards, they all become part of what you experience later. But more than anything, it was about ownership. Not in a heavy or overwhelming sense, but in a clear, shapes everything that follows. So instead of waiting for the future to arrive, you begin to see it differently. Not as something ahead of you, but as something you are continuously creating, moment by moment, choice by choice, day by day. And once you truly understand that, the question is no longer about what your future will be. It becomes about how intentionally you're willing to build it. There's a point where all of this thinking settles into something quieter, almost instinctive. You're no longer constantly analyzing every choice or questioning every direction. The awareness is still there, but it feels lighter now, more integrated into how you naturally move through your days. You begin to trust your rhythm. Not a perfect routine, not a rigid structure, but a way of operating that works for you. You know when to push and when to pause. You recognize when you're drifting and when you're aligned. And instead of reacting sharply to every fluctuation, you make small adjustments and keep going. This is where things start to feel sustainable. Because earlier, growth may have felt like effort layered on top of effort. Constantly correcting, constantly thinking, constantly trying to improve. But now, much of that effort has been absorbed into your default behavior. You don't have to convince yourself as often. You don't have to rely on bursts of motivation. You simply continue. And there's something powerful about that quiet continuation. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't feel intense. But it's steady, and that steadiness is what carries you further than any short burst ever could. At the same time, your perspective on setbacks becomes even more refined. You no longer see them as disruptions at all. They're part of the rhythm. Some days are focused, others are scattered. Some decisions are sharp, others are less so. But none of it pulls you off course in a lasting way. Because now, your direction is stronger than any single moment. You also begin to notice how much less energy you spend on unnecessary friction. Overthinking, second-guessing, comparing yourself constantly, these patterns start to fade, not because you force them out, but because they no longer serve a purpose in how you operate. Your attention becomes more valuable to you. You don't give it away as easily. You're more selective about what you engage with, what you think about, what you allow to occupy your, and that. Selectiveness creates a kind of mental clarity that makes everything else easier. Decisions feel cleaner. Actions feel more direct. Even rest feels more intentional, instead of something you fall into after exhaustion. There's also a growing sense of independence in how you think. You're less influenced by noise, trends, opinions, external pressure. Not because you ignore everything, but because you filter more carefully. You take in what's useful, and you leave the rest without needing to react to it. This allows you to stay anchored in your own direction, even when the world around you feels uncertain or constantly shifting. And that stability becomes one of your greatest advantages. Because while others may be pulled in different directions, constantly adjusting based on what's popular or immediate, you remain grounded in something deeper. Your actions are guided by clarity, not urgency. There's also a subtle shift in how you experience time. It feels less rushed. Not because you have more of it, but because you're using it differently. You're more present in what you're doing, less distracted by what you're not. And that presence creates a sense of enoughness that's hard to describe, but easy to recognize when you feel it. You're no longer constantly chasing the next thing, the next milestone, the next version of success. You're still moving forward, still improving, but without the constant feeling that where you are isn't enough. This doesn't slow you down. If anything, it makes your progress more consistent. Because you're no longer starting and stopping based on emotional highs and lows. You're moving from a place of stability. And from that stability, your capacity expands. You can take on more without feeling overwhelmed. You can think more clearly under pressure. You can handle complexity without shutting down or avoiding it. Because everything you've built, your habits, your awareness, your discipline, your mindset, it's all working together now. Not perfectly, but reliably. And that reliability changes how you see your future one final time. It's no longer something you're trying to secure, fix, or control. It's something you're equipped for. Whatever direction it takes, whatever challenges or opportunities come with it, you know you'll meet it with the same approach you've been building all along. And that removes a level full of possibility. And when you reach that point, the entire idea of future packing becomes less about effort and more about identity. It's simply how you live now. You notice, you choose, you act, you adjust. Again and again, without needing to make it complicated. And in that simplicity, there's a kind of mastery. Not loud or visible, but steady and real. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but quietly shapes everything over time. And if you stay with that long enough, there's almost nothing it can't influence. Because in the end, the future was never something separate from you. It was always being built through you. By the time you reach this point, something fundamental has settled within you. Not as a conclusion, but as a way of seeing the world that no longer needs constant reinforcement. The ideas that once felt like effort, awareness, discipline, alignment, consistency, have blended into how you naturally think and act. You're no longer trying to fix your life. You're participating in it more consciously, and that distinction changes the tone of everything. There's less urgency to become someone else, and more focus on continuing to shape who you already are. Growth is no longer a reaction to dissatisfaction. It becomes an ongoing process of refinement. You notice this in the way you approach your days. There's a sense of intention, even in simple things. You don't rush through your time as much. You don't treat moments as obstacles to get past. Instead, you engage with them more directly, because you understand that this is where your life is actually happening. And that awareness brings a certain depth to ordinary experiences. Work becomes more than just something to complete. It becomes a space where you practice focus, decision making, and standards. Conversations become more than passing interactions. They become opportunities to listen, to understand, to connect more meaningfully. Even rest becomes intentional, something you choose to support your energy rather than something you fall into out of exhaustion. There's also a noticeable shift in how you define control. Earlier, control may have meant trying to manage outcomes, avoid mistakes, or ensure things go exactly as planned. But now, control feels more grounded. It's about showing up well. It's about bringing clarity, effort, and attention into what you do, and allowing results to follow in their own time. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you effective, because your energy is focused on what actually creates impact. And over time, this way of operating builds something that's difficult to replace: quiet credibility with yourself. You trust your own decisions more. You rely less on external validation. You don't need constant reassurance that you're on the right path, because your actions already reflect it. And that internal stability becomes a kind of anchor, especially when things around you feel uncertain. There's also a deeper acceptance that develops here, not of mediocrity, but of reality. You understand that not everything will go perfectly, that there will be delays, mistakes, unexpected turns. But instead of resisting that, you work with it. You adapt faster. You recover quicker. You keep moving. And that ability to continue, regardless of conditions, is what separates temporary progress from lasting change. Another important shift is how you relate to ambition. It becomes more grounded. Less about proving something, less about chasing an image, and more about building something meaningful over time. You still want to grow. You still want to improve. But it's no longer driven by pressure or comparison. It's driven by a sense of direction, a quiet understanding of what matters to you and why. This makes your efforts more sustainable, because they're rooted in something stable rather than reactive. At the same time, you begin to appreciate how much of your life is shaped by small decisions that repeat. Not the big, dramatic moments, but the quiet patterns. How you start your day. How you respond when something is difficult. How you use small pockets of time. How you think when no one else is around. These patterns don't just influence your results, they define your experience. And because you're aware of them now, you're able to shape them more deliberately. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to make a difference. There's also a kind of humility that comes with this understanding. You realize that growth doesn't make you immune to mistakes. It just makes you better at recognizing and correcting them. And that keeps you grounded. You don't assume you've figured everything out. You stay open. You keep observing, adjusting, learning. And that openness allows you to continue evolving, even when things are already going well. In a way, the journey somewhere, more about continuing in a direction that feels aligned. And when you look back at where you started, at the idea that your future is something you pack through daily choices, it no longer feels like an abstract concept. It feels obvious. Of course your future is built this way. Of course your habits matter. Of course your thinking shapes your direction. You've experienced it, not just understood it. And that lived understanding is what stays with you. Because no matter where you go from here, no matter what changes or stays the same, you carry that awareness forward. In every decision, in every action, in every ordinary moment that once felt insignificant, but now holds more weight than ever before. And maybe that's the simplest way to see it in the end. Your future was never waiting for you somewhere ahead. It was always being created in the way you chose to live today. After a certain point, the entire idea of building a future stops feeling like a task you have to manage and starts feeling like a natural extension of how you live. There's no longer a strong separation between now and later in your mind. The way you move through today already contains the shape of what's coming next. And that realization brings a kind of quiet ease, not because life becomes simple or predictable, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. Earlier, there may have been a constant tension between what you wanted and what you did, between what you knew and how you acted. But now, that gap has narrowed. Your actions reflect your understanding more consistently, and that consistency removes a lot of internal noise. You spend less time negotiating with yourself, less time delaying, less time going back and forth over decisions you already understand. There's a clarity in how you operate that makes things feel lighter, even when the work itself is still demanding. This is where mental energy starts to free up, because when you are not constantly battling your own habits or guessing your direction, you have more space to think deeply, to notice things, to improve in ways that go beyond surface level changes. You start refining instead of correcting. The difference is subtle but important. You are no longer fixing obvious problems. You are making small, precise adjustments that improve the quality of what you are already doing. And over time, those refinements create a level of effectiveness that feels almost effortless from the outside. There's also a stronger connection between your values and your behavior now. You are not just thinking about what matters, you are living it more consistently. And that alignment creates a sense of integrity that's hard to replace. You trust yourself not just to make plans, but to follow through. Not perfectly, but reliably. And that reliability changes how you approach bigger decisions. Because when you know you can count on your own effort and consistency, you are more willing to take on challenges that once felt uncertain. You don't need guaranteed outcomes to move forward. You rely on your ability to handle whatever comes with them. At the same time, there's a growing awareness of pace. You understand that everything doesn't need to happen quickly, that forcing progress can sometimes do more harm than good. So you become more deliberate. You move with intention, not urgency. This doesn't slow you down in the long run. In fact, it often makes you more effective, because your actions are better considered, more focused, and less reactive. There's also a deeper sense of satisfaction that develops here, but it's different from what most people expect. It's not tied to big achievements or external recognition. It comes from knowing that you are operating in a way that feels right to you, that your effort is honest, that your direction is clear, that your actions are aligned. And that kind of satisfaction is stable. It doesn't disappear when things get difficult or when results take time. It stays with you, because it's rooted in how you live, not in what you achieve. Another important shift is how you handle uncertainty now. Earlier, uncertainty might have created hesitation or doubt. Now, it feels more like a normal part of the process. You don't need everything to be clear before you act. You are comfortable moving forward with partial information, adjusting as you go, and that flexibility allows you to keep progressing, even when conditions aren't ideal. You stop waiting for the perfect moment, because you understand that clarity often comes from action, not before it. There's also a stronger sense of ownership over your time and attention. You recognize how valuable they are, and you treat them accordingly. You are less likely to let them drift into things that don't matter, not your choices, in how you start your day, in how you respond to challenges, in what you say yes to, and what you decline without hesitation. All of this creates a kind of stability that doesn't depend on external conditions. Even when things around you change, your way of operating remains consistent, and that consistency becomes your advantage. Because while others may be thrown off by uncertainty, you continue moving forward, adjusting where needed, but never losing direction. And when you look at your life from this place, the idea of the future feels different once again. It's no longer something you're trying to build piece by piece with effort and attention alone. It's something that is already unfolding through you, shaped by the way you think, the way you act, and the standards you've chosen to live by. Almost quietly, almost automatically. And that leads to one final understanding that ties everything together in the simplest way possible. You don't need to constantly think about the future to build it well. You just need to live today in a way that naturally creates it. And when you truly begin to live that way, something settles that no external result can replace. It's not excitement, not even satisfaction in the usual sense. It's a kind of steadiness, a grounded feeling that comes from knowing you're no longer drifting, no longer reacting your way through life without direction. You're participating, consciously. There's a difference between living by default and living by design, and by now, that difference is no longer theoretical to you. You've felt what it's like to move through days without awareness, to let habits and circumstances decide for you. And you've also experienced what changes when you start paying attention, when your actions begin to reflect choice instead of impulse. That contrast stays with you. It sharpens how you see everything else. You start to notice how many people are still waiting for clarity, waiting for motivation, waiting for the right moment to begin. And you understand that waiting, in most cases, is just another form of delay that quietly shapes a future by default rather than intention. Not out of judgment, but out of recognition, you see how easy it is to fall into that pattern. Because you've been there. And that awareness reinforces something simple but powerful: that direction is built through movement, not thought alone. You don't need perfect clarity to take a step. You don't need certainty to begin adjusting. In fact, most of the clarity you have now came after you started, not before. And that changes how you approach anything new. You're less intimidated by the unknown, less likely to overthink the first step, more willing to engage, to try, to learn through action instead of waiting for a complete plan. There's also a growing respect for time, not in a pressured way, but in a realistic one. You understand that time will pass regardless of what you do with it, and that understanding removes the illusion that you can start later without consequence. Later is still built from now, and that makes the present more valuable, not more stressful. You don't feel the need to rush, but you also don't feel comfortable wasting what you know matters. There's a balance there, a calm urgency, if you can call it that. A steady awareness that what you do today carries forward, whether you notice it or not. At the same time, you become more forgiving with yourself, but in a grounded way. Not by lowering your standards, but by understanding the process. You don't expect perfection. You don't overreact to mistakes. You correct, you adjust, and you continue. Because stopping completely is no longer an option that makes sense to you. You've seen what consistency does over time. You've felt how small actions, repeated without much attention, can shape something meaningful. And once you experience that, it becomes difficult to return to a way of living where days are treated as disposable. They're not. They accumulate. Quietly, steadily, without asking for your permission. And that accumulation is always moving in a direction, whether you're guiding it or not. This is what makes the entire idea so simple, and yet so easy to overlook. There's no single moment where your future is decided. No dramatic turning point that defines everything at once. It's happening continuously. In how you think when you wake up. In what you choose to focus on. In whether you follow through or delay. In how you respond when things are uncomfortable. None of these moments seem significant on their own. But together, they form a pattern. And that pattern becomes your life. By now, you don't need to be reminded of that. You can see it. Not just in theory, but in your own experience. And that's what, without needing to be named. You simply notice more. You choose more carefully. You act more intentionally. And you adjust when needed. Again and again. There's no finish line to this. No point where you can say it's complete. Because as long as you're living, you're continuing to shape what comes next. But instead of feeling endless or overwhelming, that realization becomes grounding. Because it means you're never stuck. You're never locked into one path without the ability to change it. At any moment, through any small decision, you can begin shifting direction. And that's where the real sense of control comes from. Not from predicting the future. Not from forcing outcomes. But from understanding, deeply and clearly, that your life is built in real time. Choice by choice. Moment by moment. Day by day. And once you truly see that, you don't need to chase the future anymore. You just need to keep showing up in a way that creates it. At this stage, everything becomes quieter, but also clearer. There's no need to keep reminding yourself of what matters, no need to constantly return to the same ideas for motivation. What once felt like effort has now settled into awareness, and that awareness shapes your behavior without demanding attention. You begin to live with a kind of subtle precision. Not perfection, but intention. The small things are no longer overlooked. The way you speak, the way you listen, the way you use your time when nothing urgent is happening, all of it carries a certain weight now. Not pressure, just awareness that these moments are not separate from your future. They are your future, unfolding in real time. And because of that, there's less internal conflict. You're not pulled as strongly between what you know you should do and what you feel like doing. That gap, which once required discipline to manage, has narrowed. Your instincts have been shaped by repetition, and now they work with you more often than against you. This is where life starts to feel more integrated. You're no longer switching between different versions of yourself depending on the situation. The way you think, the way you act, the way you respond, it's more consistent across different areas of your life. And that consistency creates a sense of stability that's hard to disrupt. Even when things around you change, you don't feel like you're starting over. You adapt, but you don't lose yourself in the process. There's also a noticeable shift in how you experience pressure. It doesn't disappear, but it changes form. Instead of feeling overwhelming or paralyzing, it becomes something you can work with. You understand your capacity better. You know when to push, when to step back, and how to maintain balance without losing direction. And that understanding makes you more resilient. Not because you avoid difficulty, but because you've built the ability to move through it without losing clarity. At the same time, your relationship with success continues to evolve. It becomes quieter, more personal. Less about recognition, less about comparison, and more about alignment with your own standards. You measure progress differently now, not just by what you achieve, but by how you operate, by the quality of your thinking, by the consistency of your actions, by how closely your daily life reflects what actually matters to you. And that shift removes a lot of unnecessary pressure, because you're no longer chasing something external to feel like you're moving forward. You can see it in your own behavior, in your own patterns, in the way you handle both progress and setbacks. There's also a deeper sense of responsibility, but it feels lighter than before. It's no longer tied to guilt or pressure, it's tied to awareness. You understand that your choices matter, not in a dramatic sense, but in a steady, cumulative way. And that understanding naturally influences how you move through your days. You don't need to force yourself to care. You already do. Another subtle change is how you handle time that used to feel empty or unimportant. Waiting, resting, transitioning between tasks, these moments are no longer treated as gaps to fill mindlessly. You're more present in them, more aware of how you're thinking, what you're absorbing, how you're resetting. And that presence improves the quality of everything else. Because it's not just about what you do when you're focused or productive. It's also about how you manage the spaces in between. This creates a rhythm that feels sustainable. You're not constantly pushing, but you're also not drifting. You're moving at a pace that allows you to continue, to adjust, to stay consistent without burning out or losing direction. And from that place, your confidence becomes quieter, but stronger. It's no longer based on what might. Kind of confidence doesn't need to be expressed loudly. It shows up in how you carry yourself, in how you make decisions, in how you handle uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed by it. At this point, the idea of shaping your future is no longer something you actively think about every day. It's something you're doing naturally, in your habits, in your standards, in the way you respond to life as it unfolds. And because of that, the future no longer feels like something separate or distant. It feels connected, already in motion, already influenced by who you've chosen to become. And as you continue forward, there's only one thing that really matters. Not how far ahead you can see, but whether the way you're living right now is something you'd be willing to carry with you into whatever comes next. There's a quiet clarity that comes with that question, because it removes everything unnecessary. It doesn't ask you to predict outcomes or imagine distant scenarios. It brings your attention back to something much simpler and much more honest, the way you are living right now. Because in the end, that's the only thing you ever truly carry forward. Not your plans in their perfect form, not your intentions as you once imagined them, but your patterns, your habits, your way of thinking and responding. These are the things that persist, that repeat, that shape what your life gradually becomes. And when you look at it from that perspective, it becomes easier to see what matters and what doesn't. You stop getting lost in unnecessary complexity. You stop overvaluing things that don't contribute to your direction. And you start paying more attention to what actually moves your life forward, even if it seems small or ordinary. There's a kind of simplicity here, but it's not superficial. It's the result of understanding something deeply enough that you no longer need to complicate it. You know that how you spend your time matters. You know that what you repeat becomes who you are. You know that small decisions, made consistently, carry more weight than occasional effort. And because you know these things not just intellectually but through experience, you begin to trust them. That trust changes how you approach your days. You don't feel the need to constantly search for new strategies or external answers. You return to the fundamentals, showing up, paying attention, acting with intention, adjusting when needed. And that return, again and again, creates a kind of stability that doesn't depend on circumstances. At the same time, there's a deeper sense of acceptance that develops, but it's important to understand it clearly. It's not about settling or lowering your expectations. It's about accepting the reality of how progress actually works, that it's gradual, that it requires repetition, that it often feels slow before it becomes visible. And that understanding protects you from the frustration that comes from expecting immediate results. You become more patient, not because you're forcing yourself to wait, but because you see the process more clearly. You understand that what you're building takes time, and that time is part of the process, not an obstacle to it. There's also a stronger sense of focus that comes from this clarity. You're less distracted by things that don't align with your direction. Not because they disappear, but because they lose their importance in your mind. You see them, but you don't follow them. And that ability to stay aligned, even in the presence of distraction, becomes one of the most valuable skills you carry forward. Because life doesn't become quieter or simpler externally. There will always be noise, options, competing demands. But internally, you become more steady, more selective, more intentional. And that internal steadiness shapes everything else. It influences how you make decisions, how you spend your energy, how you respond when things don't go as planned. It keeps you from overreacting, from drifting too far off course, from losing sight of what matters. There's also a quiet sense of discipline that continues to strengthen, but now it feels almost invisible. It's not something you think about often. It shows up in your consistency, in your standards, in the way you follow through without needing to negotiate with yourself. And that quiet discipline is what allows you to keep moving forward, even when motivation is low, even when results are not immediate. It's what turns intention into reality over time. At this point, the idea of building your future has become less about effort and more about identity. It's not something you do occasionally. It's how you live. And because of that, the future no longer feels uncertain in the same way it once did. Not because you know exactly what will happen, fear that many people carry without realizing it. Because the fear was never just about the future itself. It was about not knowing how you would handle it. Now, that part is clear. And with that clarity, you're able to move forward with a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not rushed, not driven by pressure, but steady, grounded, intentional. And as everything settles into that steadiness, there's nothing left to chase, nothing left to force into place. There's only the ongoing process of living in a way that continues to shape what comes next. One decision at a time, one action at a time, one day at a time. And that, in the simplest possible way, is how the future is built. And when everything is stripped down to that level of simplicity, something becomes very clear: there was never a complicated formula to begin with. What made it feel complex was the distance between knowing and doing, between intention and action. Once that gap closes, even partially, everything else starts to fall into place more naturally. You stop searching for something more, not because there isn't more to learn, but because you understand that what truly matters is already within reach. It's in how you think, how you act, how you respond, the fundamentals that were always there, just often overlooked. There's a quiet confidence in returning to those fundamentals again and again. You wake up, you choose how to approach the day. You face something difficult, you choose how to respond. You have time to spend, you choose where it goes. These moments don't feel extraordinary, but they are where everything is decided. Not in a single instance, but in repetition. In the accumulation of choices that slowly, steadily define your direction. And what's changed now is that you see it. You don't move through these moments unconsciously anymore. There's a level of awareness that stays with you, even when you're not actively thinking about it. It's become part of how you operate. This awareness doesn't make life rigid. If anything, it makes it more fluid. Because you're no longer reacting blindly. You're responding with clarity, adjusting as needed, staying aligned without needing constant correction. There's also a sense of completeness that begins to emerge, not as an endpoint, but as a way of experiencing your life as it is. You're no longer postponing satisfaction until some future moment. You're no longer telling yourself that things will feel better once you arrive somewhere else. You recognize that the quality of your life is shaped in the present, and because you're living with intention now, that quality has already improved. This doesn't mean you stop striving or growing. It means your growth is no longer tied to dissatisfaction. It comes from curiosity, from a desire to refine, to deepen, to continue evolving. And that makes the process feel lighter, more sustainable, more real. At the same time, you develop a deeper respect for consistency than ever before. Not as a concept, but as something you've experienced firsthand. You've seen what happens when you stay with something long enough. How small efforts begin to compound. How progress that once felt invisible becomes undeniable over time. And because of that, you're less tempted by shortcuts. You understand that anything built quickly without a strong foundation is unlikely to last. So you focus on what is steady, what is repeatable, what you can rely on even when conditions aren't perfect. There's also a shift in how you relate to setbacks, but now it's almost second nature. When something goes wrong, you don't dramatize it. You don't let it define your direction. You simply adjust and continue. That ability to continue, without turning every mistake into something bigger than it is, becomes one of your greatest strengths. Because it keeps you moving. It keeps you building. It keeps you from losing momentum over things that, in the long run, are just part of the process. And as this way of living becomes more stable, you start to notice something else. A sense of quiet pride. Not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that comes from knowing how you're showing up in your own life. From seeing your actions align with your values. From recognizing that you're no longer leaving things to chance in the same way you once did. It's subtle, but it matters. Because it reinforces everything you've built. It reminds you that this way of living is not accidental. It's something you've chosen, repeatedly. And that choice continues every day. There's no final moment where it's done. No point where you can stop paying attention completely. But it doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like ownership. Not irrelevant, but less dominant. Because you understand that if you keep living this way, with awareness, with intention, with consistency, the future will reflect that, naturally. You don't need to force it. You don't need to constantly worry about it. You just need to continue. And in that continuation, there's a kind of peace that's hard to find any other way. Not because everything is certain, but because your approach is. And that, more than anything else, is what carries forward, quietly, steadily, shaping everything that comes next.